In this screencast, we're going to talk about the aggregate production function. We're going to define the measures and determinants of economic growth, and we're also going to explain these determinants of economic growth. The aggregate production function shows how the productivity, or the output per worker, depends on the quantities of physical capital per worker and human capital per worker, as well as the state of technology. So when we talk about physical capital, we're talking about capital stock or capital formation and natural resources. Usually when we're tested on the impact of capital stock. When we talk about human capital, we talk about the education and the skill training that workers possess. We're usually tested on education when we talk about that. So this aggregate production function here, if you notice, you have your physical capital per worker that is on the horizontal axis, and you have the real GDP or real output per worker on the vertical axis. Productivity that you see that is being measured here is the combination of technology per worker, physical capital per worker, and human capital per worker. Notice that as physical capital per worker is increasing, so is the real output per worker. When we're talking about economic growth, we're measuring it as GDP per capita over time. And when we talk about the formula for GDP per capita, this would be the GDP, which is our C plus I plus G plus XN, divided by the population. That's our GDP per capita. Notice here that aggregate employment and aggregate output are directly related. In order to be able to get more output, you have to employ more workers. And so that's what we're looking at, is how is it that we're able then to increase our productivity with the workers that we have. When we look at the average labor productivity, we're looking at output divided by the employed worker. So output per worker is really important when we look at the measure that you have of productivity. And the aggregate production function shows that output per capita is positive related to both physical capital and human capital. And so that's a really important concept when you're seeing that. But notice here that it's not always going the slope at the same rate. It starts to level off as you have more and more of the physical capital. For those that have taken micro, that brings us to this concept here of the diminishing returns to physical capital. If human capital and technology remain the same, then with each additional unit of physical capital per worker, it leads to smaller and smaller increases in productivity. And so if you don't have that technology or the increase in education, in order to be able to bump up the productivity of the capital that's being used, you're going to see diminishing returns. And so how is it that we can shift up the productivity when we're looking here at utilizing the physical capital per worker, the technology per worker, and the human capital per worker? The major impact in being able to shift this up is with technology. You can see here that when you have technology from 1940 compared to technology with 2010, how much the productivity has increased. And that is a major catalyst when we are looking at that. So in order to have total factor productivity in all aspects, you need to be able to have that technology, because the economy then can produce more output with the same quantity of physical capital, human capital, and labor. So the two major things that I want to stress from the aggregate production function is the positive relationship that you have with real output per worker as you increase the physical capital per worker and the human capital per worker. And the other big takeaway is that economic growth is calculated with GDP per capita. where you're looking at the GDP divided by the population.